Hello and welcome to the Interpreting Wine Hospitality Podcast with me, your host and podcast founder, Lawrence Francis. Welcoming you to this series celebrating the category of sherry. Released during Sherry Week 2019, this series will transport you to the region via conversations with Señor Beltrán Domecq of the Consejo Regulador and winemakers and owners of several bodega houses in the region. Sharing this information in podcast format, a first for the region. These 9 episodes will bust some myths about sherry that still exist in the marketplace and educate and attract a whole new audience of sherry drinker. So without further ado, here's today's episode of the series. Today's episode of the Sherry Week special features a guided tour of Bodegas Osborne. Led by Global Marketing Manager Mariangel Lezama and Winemaker Marcos Alguacil, we get an overview of Grupo Osborne and its brands. We hear technical details from Marcos of the aging that takes place in Sanlúcar de Barrameda. And Mariangel takes us through the stories of some of their very rare sherries. Enjoy.
So welcome again. We are absolutely delighted to have all of you here with us today at Bodegas Osborne at the heart of our company. And this is basically where everything started for us. So most of you might know today that Osborne or Group Osborne is now a very diversified business. It's a 100% family-owned business, but it started back in 1772 with sherry that as the origin of and the foundation of the company. But today, it has diversified to 100% Iberico ham, which is called Cinco Jotas. We'll be able to taste some of that later on during our dinner cocktail. It also has 2 other wineries, one in Rioja called Bodegas Montecillo, which is a 150-year-old winery in the heart of Rioja, in Rioja Alta, and also another winery in Castilla called Bodegas Osborne Malpica de Tajo for more retail wines in that sense. But as I was saying at the beginning, this is really the origin of the company. So back in the 18th century, Thomas Osborne Mann, he set sail from Devon with that ambition to really, well, there was a big demand in London for sherry wines, and he was driven with that business impulse, and he set sail to Jerez, and he established a very good relationship with Sir James Duff, who was the British consul in Cádiz at the time, who started his own business of exporting sherry wine back to the UK. And then his nephew, William Gordon, was managing the wineries with James Duff as well. And later on, Thomas Osborne Mann became the first manager of the winery, and then later on acquired all of the wineries, and then that's where the Osborne business actually started from. You just fast forward to a couple of centuries, almost 250. We're going to be celebrating our 250th anniversary now in 2022. And we're here where everything started, but the wines have a lot of history by their own, and there's a lot of wines that are almost as old as the winery itself. So we're going to start at the young section. The wines that you have around here are 12 years old. These are actually wines that we do not commercialize. Actually, people have not tasted these wines at all, with the exception of Sarah Jane, of course. What we have here is a Solera called La Honda. La Honda was actually, all of these wines were actually at another part of the building, and the building was called La Honda because it's supposedly a little bit deeper in terms of the soil itself. And then later on, everything in terms of the old sherry wines was consolidated in this area. So we have Fino La Honda, which is the one that you're tasting right now, which is a 12 and a half-year-old sherry, which is a Fino. And we also have an Amontillado La Honda, which we have in another section of the winery, which we're not going to be tasting today. But they're very special wines. We don't commercialize it at all. It's only for family consumption. But we wanted to share it with you today, being such a special occasion. That being said, I want to introduce our chief winemaker, Marcos Alguacil. I know that he's already had a little bit of a show over there. I cannot do it, so I leave him do all the spectacle around it. So let's just talk a little bit about this wine in particular.
Yes, about this Fino, this is a very special Fino. First of all, because it has 12 years old.
a fino is impossible technically to have 12 years under the floor volume. Why? Because the yeast is an alive who has to eat not only ethanol to produce the acetaldehydrogenase and other ones, but it needs some other vitamins, and year after year these vitamins go out exhausted, you know. So the last 2 or 3 years in this aging, of course in the dynamic aging system, Sake, Rocío, Solera, a mixing one. The last 2 or 3 years, the floor is exhausted. It's difficult for the floor to develop and to grow in the surface of the wine. So the wine, in a has a naturally amontillamiento. Se va in a oxidation aging, 1 month with floor, 1 month without floor. Okay, so the oxygen came inside and produced a fino evolved to an amontillado, a little amontillado. So it's a wine between an amontillado and a fino. So it has 16 alcohol degree. Because of the concentration, the evaporation of the water year after year, you have an ethanol concentration, you know. So it has a very, very strong malt. It has a lot of structure, but it has the pungent nose and the almond. Mix it with notes, so it's a little bit mixing with Fino and Amontillado.
And precisely because of that strength that Marcos was talking about, this Solera, of course, is really old. And back in the day, they decided to, the actual consumers decided that it was a little bit too strong. So they decided to bottle, instead of the Solera, to bottle the 5th Criadera, because that was going to be fresher in style. And that's how our flagship brand called Fino Quinta was born, because Fino Quinta means the 5th. So the wine that came from the 5th Solera that was lighter in style to this was the one that was bigger in sales for just a standard consumption. All right, so just going back to the wines itself, as I was saying, this is the young part of the winery. In this winery in particular, we only have our very old and rare sherry collection, starting with these two, again, not being commercialized. We have also a brandy, spirits business. As I was mentioning at the beginning, there's the Jamón Cinco Jotas, but there's also brands, international brands for brandy like Carlos I, Veterano, or Magno, which are also a very important part of the company. Other spirits like anise, aniseed, and then gins like Nordés or Ampersand. We don't have any of that brandy in this winery. We have it in a separate location, especially because back in the day, where we're at now, used to be an industrial zone. Right now you've seen that it's beautiful alleyways and restaurants and people living around. But back in the day, it was really the industrial zone because we're really close to the river. And you know that the sherry used to be shipped to the UK like this, in these bots. It wasn't bottled at all. So they would just roll out the bots to these streets over here, which were actually open. We closed it later on, a century later. But the bots would be just rolled out. They would go to the ships, and then they would set sail to the UK. So this area overall, there was sherry, but there was also brandy. But now, because brandy and the alcohol content, it's in terms of safety hazards, it's very dangerous to have it around people that live in the area. So it has been now sent to another part of El Puerto Santa Maria. So here we only have sherries. So we're going to continue our tour. We're going to go to where we have the very old and rare sherry collection. So if this is 12 years, we're going to go past our 25, 30, 40, and we lose count with how old the wines are over there. I just want to show you quickly, we're just going to do a little bit of a detour here to show you one particular bot, which is really interesting to our story. So if you want to follow me this way, just a very quick side note. I'm sure that most of you have already visited wineries in Jerez, in El Puerto, or in Sanlúcar de Barrameda. You might notice that we have all these iron cast metal-y things, which is what we used to use back in the day to actually mark the bots that would then go to our clients worldwide. So you would find the names of the clients themselves, or of the style of sherry, or the style by icons. So many of the styles had their own icons. So that's what we used to do when we didn't have bottles back in the day, just to make sure that we had a very specific, let's say, we kept track of what we were sending to our markets. So at the end of the day, the winery is it's active history, and it's a museum at the same time as well. So this Solera over here, as you can see, it's quite old. It actually has still the original markings of the Duff Gordon family, and it was later on used to age a very special wine for the Osborne family. So back in 1903, the second Count of Osborne, Thomas Osborne Gesala, he had a son called Antonio. And he decided to set aside a whole Solera. This is just one of the bots of that original Solera. So he set aside a complete Solera, and he decided to lock it. So he installed these locks, which we still have one here. And he refused for none of the wine to be bottled, well, to be drawn from the bot, until Antonio, his son, turned 21. So that was in 1924. And it was just basically a tribute to the birth of his son. And now this wine in particular we are bottling. It is called it's still called AOS, and it stands for Antonio Osborne Solera. Okay, so it's one of the sherries in our rare sherry collection. We have 5 of those wines. So it's an amontillado in style, 30-year-old. Beautiful wines. So let's just continue, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this story. So this is basically it. So this is the cathedral, as we call it. So this is where our sacristia wines are, and this is where the oldest collection, the family collection, is being sheltered. So here we have two really big bots. They are 2,300 liters, and they basically mark, as a tribute, the foundation of the company. One with the Duff Gordon family, and the other with the last name of Thomas Osborne, our founder in 1772. In this area here, we basically have the largest collection of very old and rare sherries in the triangle of Jerez and in the world. It's a collection that has been consolidated by the Osborne family for many, many years, many decades. The latest wines to be acquired, they were back in 2008. They were 4 wines that belonged before to the Domecq family, and before that, well, we have many other wineries that had basically taken the history and the bots throughout the years. There is a very particular story, which is Cappuccino. Yeah, one of the Soleras is Cappuccino. This is one of the 4 Soleras that the Osborne family acquired almost 10 years ago, well, more than 10 years ago. And it's a really interesting story because this Solera was originally established by the Capuchin friars that settled in Jerez in the 17th century. They were actually the monasteries just in front of the Consejo Regulador. And we have been investigating a lot, and it turns out that there were vines at the monastery. So we don't know exactly whether the monks were doing the wine for themselves, for their consumption, and for the regular use, or if they decided to ask Blasquez, the winery before Blasquez, to make this wine for them, and then have it as their wine for the monastery. And that's where the name comes from. And it's actually one of the oldest Soleras in the whole sherry triangle. It was established in 1790. So whenever you have a glass of that wine, there is wine from the 1790. The exact percentage is a very complicated arithmetic operation that Marcos can do. I can't. So you have to explain. Please explain.
Okay.
I'm very proud because of Osborne family have rescued some wines that not only in Puerto de Santa Maria but in Jerez owned 2 very old wineries
like Domecq, like you said, and Osborne rescue from the multinationals.
Yeah, well, they're rescued by. Unfortunately, Jerez has. There's been a lot of decline in the sherry market. Not a lot of people knew the real value in sherry, and there was a lot of very cheap brands that were sold worldwide. So Osborne really understood, as well with the Consejo Regulador, and really the value behind these wines, and they successfully managed to save them, basically.
Yes. So it's impossible to earn money with these jewels, with these wines, because we have to move every 4 months. We have to move it from the sobretablas to the soleras. So it's impossible to. Perhaps we use for a bottle, we use more than 100 hours of work. We don't know, because a lot of liquid here, staging here, was managed in the past, not with pumps, but with jars.
Yeah, everything by hand.
These are not wines for earn money, of course. I think, but the head of Osborne family, I think they like to have this museum here, maintaining the way of aging these wines exactly in the same way as in the past. We receive when we receive a brand, we receive a recipe,
like the recipe.
A recipe, and exactly the way the proportional parts of each criadera who has to pass, So we, as winemaker, we only have to read all recipes and trying to do it in the same way, to maintain exactly the same flavors and the same structure as we think in the past had.
Yeah, that consistency through time on these wines is really, really important. Just going back to this example that Marcos was explaining, when we acquired these 4 wines, in terms of the negotiation itself with Domecq and Pernod Ricard, etc., everything was settled. The price and the date and everything in terms of the financial part of it. And the very last thing was the actual recipe, because that's really the most important thing. And I mean, Marcos might just say it like that, like we just need to follow the recipe, but just following the recipe, as he was saying, requires 100 work hours for a bottle. So there's a lot of effort, there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of passion behind that. In terms of the people and the team that we have working here, it's not just opening, and having some easy product. It's really a lot of history behind each bottle. So going back to what we have here, as I said, we only commercialize 9 of these wines. There are more that we actually don't commercialize at all. So the family decided to keep the commercialization of those 4 wines from the previous Domecq family. So they're 4 styles: an amontillado, which is 51 first, an oloroso called Sibarita, a palo cortado, which is cappuccino, the one that we were mentioning here, and a very naturally sweet Pedro Ximénez called Venerable. Those 4. And then we have 5 additional wines, which are the baby of the family, since one of them is the one that I showed you over there, the AOS. But that's an amontillado. Then we have olorosos, which are BC 200. We have Solera India. We have P Triangle P, and we have a sweet wine. So we're going to see all of the Soleras here. And the most important thing about these wines is that each of them has a really interesting story. So I already explained the one about AOS. Then we have BC 200, which the Solera is this way. So we'll just have a look at it and we continue telling you a little bit about the story. So I just got a question before whether all of the wines and the Soleras were here. They actually are. So for all the wines, the very old and rare sherries that we commercialize, everything is here. So this is it. But what is really, I guess, it's a different way of understanding sherry and the sherry business is in terms of the theory. And, for those who have probably done the WSET, there's the normal, the theory, that you have the Solera, which is on the floor level, because floor in Spanish is suelo, and then you have the first criadera, second criadera, third criadera, and then the aging process goes from the youngest to the oldest one. In the practice, for wines that are this old, that doesn't happen at all that way. So this might be the whole solera, and then that might be the criadera, and then that might be the second criadera over there. So actually all the wines are basically everywhere around the winery. It doesn't necessarily have that pyramid scheme. It does in terms of which wine goes from which bots to the next, but physically it actually isn't that way in the practice, basically. But it's easier to understand the other way around. So just very quickly, a little bit about the story of BC 200 is really interesting. This Solera originally consisted of 200 bots, and they were each named A, B, and C. But it turned out that the Tsar in St. Petersburg back in the 1860s liked this wine so much, he was basically the biggest client of this wine, decided to acquire the whole Solera A, and the only thing that remained for us were the B and the C. So as an homage basically to the original 200 bots, the wine is now called BC 200. And that's an oloroso in style. But we also have Solera India, which is another oloroso. Solera India was a wine that we thought originally that it was exported to India, but it turned out that it was commercialized, well, it was actually sent to the diplomatic mission in Las Indias, so the Indies, back in the time of the Spanish ruling of South America, and in particular to Peru and Colombia. So that's where it went, because it went to Las Indias rather than to India, actually. And then the other oloroso is P Triángulo P, which the Solera is partly over there and partly over there. P Triangle P. It basically starts from the fact that this wine is so old. It's 1911. Remind me, Marcos. Established in 1911, and the first P stands for Palo Cortado because it started as a Palo Cortado. The triangle is again a tribute to the Triangle of Jerez, and the second P is from the Puerto Santa Maria. Beautiful wine as well. And then, as I said, the last one is Pedro Ximénez, which is the bot that's over there. Do you want to say something about the wines themselves? Or
only we have here the sacristia, which is the place where the ecclesiastical power came and ¿cómo se dice? Bendice el vino.
They would bless the wine here.
Yeah. So this is called sacristia, and the wines are wines of sacristia, Perhaps only talk about Washington Irving.
Is anybody from America here today? Yes? Okay, so you might know Washington Irving. So he was actually our first importer back in the day, because he loved a wine so much that we still have one of the Soleras that we used to have for him, and he signed that bot in particular, Washington Irving. So our first export partner for America. Okay, so the last one that we wanted to show you before we go to the next bit of the event is one of the most remarkable bots that we have at the winery. We apologize for the lights. There's not a lot of light here at the moment. So as I mentioned before, for every wine you will see which wine it is, if it's one of the 9 wines I mentioned before, or some other wines like this, Alonso El Sabio, which we don't bottle, we don't commercialize. But this in particular, so this might be a whole Solera, there might be another Solera over there, but for PX, old PX, the Solera is this, and that's it. It is a single bot Solera. So all of the wine drawn for the bottling of this wine comes from this specific bot. So Marcos will explain a little bit more. You can see actually how much in terms of the evaporation throughout the years. This Solera was established in 1902. You can see the barrel itself. We know that it's much earlier than 1903.
Yes, we don't know the years of construction of this boot. We think 200 years ago, perhaps, more or less. No? But the barrel has contained PX, Pedro Ximénez, all the time, you know. And in these 200 years, the barrel has created a layer of caramel in the inside, of course. You can see here the caramel because of the tasting one. And this layer, we think, has the flavor, the final flavor of the wine.
But it's really interesting because what Marcos is explaining is what we see on the outside is actually also happening in the inside. So it's sort of a velo de flor, but made out of caramel, which makes this wine so distinct in terms of the palate because it's that flor is sort of covering the whole bot from the inside, and throughout the years it's just basically stuck there. Yeah. So you'll be able to see it on the profile, and there's also something really interesting about this wine, which only Marcos can explain, that it's the color.
The color is, when you have PX very, very old, you start to see in the glass slides of green
like
color,
green hints.
You know, yes. Like copper, like the copper when oxidized. But PX in 25, 30 years of aging, you can see this slightly green brights, you know. It's like when you make a caramel in the span.
Just caramel, if you put sugar in a pan and then you make caramel.
Liquid caramel, you make caramel in 2 seconds or 1 minute, you know. But here you make the same chemical reaction in 30 years, you know, or more. We don't know.
So it's basically creating this color and these flavors without the heat. That's what's really interesting about this process.
So you can taste some roasted toast, tobacco, and cocoa, and everything, due to the barrel, not only to the wine, but to the barrel. Not oak, yes, a little bit of oak, very old oak, but roasted and caramel smoke, you know.
Well, you'll be the judge when you taste it later on tonight, but keep in mind that whenever anybody tells you, here there's a 30-year-old Pedro Ximénez, if there's not a green hint, it's not 30-year-old. So now you know. There was just one question over here in terms of maintaining the average age. So I mentioned a couple of the original foundation dates of some of the wines. So I mentioned the 1790 for Cappuccino. Sibarita is from 1792. P Triangle P is from 1911. In order to maintain that average age of the wine, we need to never draw more than 1.5% of the total Solera. A Solera might be, in this case, for example, 7 bots. In the case of Pedro Ximénez, only 1 bot, as we saw, but we cannot extract more than 1.5%. In some cases, it might go up to 3%, because otherwise we lose that average age, and then we would have issues with the Consejo Regulador as well. And the profile of the wine would be completely different, because we would dilute it. If we draw more, it means that we need to bring fresher wine, and fresher wine, and fresher wine, and then the palate will be completely different as well.
Thank you so much to Mariangel, Marcos, and all at Grupo Osborne. This tour took place on the first night of my visit to Jerez and provided a wonderful start to the proceedings. You can, of course, find below details of Osborne's website and main social media handles. And of course, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. Next time on the Sherry Week special in episode 328, we get a very exclusive guided tour of Bodegas Tradición. See you then.